have noticed that today's younger people are living with their parents for far longer than at any time in modern history. The rise of fandom, which you can think of as hanging onto of childhood affection for typically fantasy and science fiction intellectual properties well into adulthood beyond what might be considered a normal and healthy liking, as well as the rise of cartoons marketed to adults and the multi-billion-dollar video game industry, has all fed into the rise of the adult child, or more specifically the man-child, and I'll use that term interchangeably to describe both adult children who are men and adult children who are women. In the not distant past, it was normal for an adult to move out of their parents' house at the age of 18 or 19, and by 25 was typically married with children on the way. Now young men and women are waiting to have children until far later than before, with catastrophic consequences for society. This did not happen in a vacuum. This was at least partially fueled overtly by the sexual revolution as part of rising secularism, especially the adoption of birth control by the mainline Protestant denominations, which enabled sexuality to be seen as a mere entertainment and the pursuit of pleasure as the natural right of human beings. We become a society of pleasure seekers. Now, we have the media telling the majority population not to have children, bolstered by stories of young professionals who live a surprisingly high standard of living given their income level, made possible by not having children, or so the story goes. The consumer culture promotes endless products that promote extending childhood into the 30s. One only has to look to Hollywood and the sustained dominance of children's characters in movies marketed to adults for evidence. The consequences are serious. Declining birth rates in the US and Europe are headed towards catastrophe for the dominant population, leading these same media and academic elites who champion not having children to call for open borders and importing large amounts of poor people from the third world to serve as the new slave labor and tax base to subsidize the lifestyles for the permanent man-children so they can live. And don't think that women are exempt. This pleasure-seeking undermines modesty, chastity, and authentic femininity, leading to promiscuity and childlessness among the women of the majority population. Again, we live in a pleasure-seeking, hedonistic culture. Childlessness and rampant sexual promiscuity are fed by an increasingly vapid culture in the US and the broader West. This vapid culture that is by definition relativist leads to a lot of bizarre social movements, all rooted in the constant perpetual childhood. We see the childish reduction of traditional relationships in both the MGTOW and pickup artist so-called communities. If you don't know what MGTOW is, it's men going their own way. These men have given up dating, relationships, marriage, everything in exchange for pornography and a sort of false brotherhood among men who rightly reject feminism in all its forms for the toxicity that feminism creates. MGTOW is a toxic response to toxic femininity. In a more mainstream way, though, one very real danger of perpetual childishness is the rise of feelings trumping reason. We see this in mainstream political discourse and even in the church. In the church, you only have to look towards prelates offering Holy Communion to Protestants and marriages with Catholics as just one example. The Casparites rule by emotions and are a real threat to what little remaining orthodoxy there is in the hierarchy. But in the broader social sense, we see emotional reasoning in virtually all political issues that come up daily, and Catholics seem equally susceptible to this. When the grossly distorted story about ICE allegedly separating parents from their children emerged, I saw most of my Novus Ordo neo-Catholic friends responding emotionally, and their response persisted when the real facts emerged the next day. Perpetual childhood has killed reason, making people more susceptible to manipulation by the secular elites. There is no greater example of the rule of emotion in the public sphere today than in the reaction to anything President Trump does. The pure rage that certain segments of the population respond to his actions with, real or perceived, is utterly irrational. It is a form of idolatry. Not a worship of Trump, but a worship of the self. These people are enslaved to their emotions. This is a central facet of the perpetual childhood. The man-child is a slave to his passions. There is no discipline for the man-child. Yes, the man-child may spend hours each day in the gym and may have the superficial discipline to pursue a nutrition regimen. It is a spiritually undisciplined life, for the reaction of the mind to political stimulus gives evidence to both mental and spiritual discipline. The reaction to the man-child is equally dangerous. The man-child and the feminist goes hand in hand in an unholy matrimony. Their undermining of society inevitably creates a backlash, and that backlash is the alt-right. I am not alt-right, nor am I especially against the alt-right. They make a few serious errors, which I will explain in a future video. But the creation of a growing movement that stands against the man-child that fuels the rage and emotiveness of the man-children is equally dangerous. The man-children have destabilized society through their emotiveness. The very real laws of physics. For every action is an equal and opposite reaction, and the alt-right are a reaction to the rising number of man-children in our society. The real cure for perpetual childishness and the man-children is Jesus Christ, traditional Catholicism, the traditional family, and traditional masculinity and femininity. As St. Paul says in his first letter to the Corinthians, "When I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I gave up childish ways." Our culture attacks manhood because it has already all but destroyed womanhood. When masculinity and manhood have been fully destroyed, the family unit will finally fall. This hedonistic culture has made Americans dangerously immature. Dangerous because emotional thinking enables us all to be taken advantage of by political activists who have a brazenly anti-Catholic and anti-family agenda. Emotional thinking is not thinking. A simple case in point. We saw this week the announcement of the new nominee to the U.S. Supreme Court, Judge Kavanaugh. Protesters outside wore blank and confused expressions on their faces, cheering and booing on command, despite it being obvious that they had no idea what they were protesting beyond a phantom threat of what they were told was a literal Nazi being put on the court.
40 years of justice upholding institutional racism. 40 years of a justice voting to make the life of immigrants more difficult. 40 years of a justice chipping away at the rights of LGBTQ people. Come on now. 40 years of a justice voting to sell our democracy to the highest bidder.
These are the same types of people who make the most absurd comparisons of real-life public figures to fictional figures, Harry Potter being the most often cited. For my money, this might be the most annoying comparison made, even more irritating than to Hitler, because at least Hitler was a real figure. Another major danger this immaturity breeds is in our spiritual life. The man-children have an increasingly great influence in the life of the church. Possibly the worst idea in Catholic circles since women's ordination in the charismatic movement has been the soon-to-be youth synod, where emotional slaves will tell the magisterial authority that the church needs to get with the times on abortion, the so-called rainbow rights, and gender identity. Why? No reason, just emotions. The problems in the church have been caused by emotional thinking, which leads to sin, not with the church being behind the times. Sin characterizes our times. We all recently survived another Pride Month, where we were all treated to people celebrating at least 2 of the 7 deadly sins on public display, all while co-opting the symbol of God's promise after the flood to now symbolize their utter hatred of God and God's law. When our disordered pride, the first sin, is damaged, people lose their minds. This video went viral, and for good reason. This poor woman, I think, is having an utter meltdown because her religion, leftist politics, was rejected and the man she was convinced was literally Hitler had just been sworn into office.
Donald J. Trump is now President of the United States. President Obama is the ex-president. And Mr. Trump, for the moment, steps away for the inaugural address.
What a great honor to be able to introduce for the first time ever anywhere the 45th President of the United States of America, Donald.
Tap on the shoulder. You adjust the microphone as you told, man.
Our duty is to reject this emotional thinking. The Christian duty is to grow up and not live as a perpetual child. Yes, liking Star Wars or Marvel films or whatever can be a fine thing when enjoying those things in a way that is rightly ordered. But refusing to grow up is extremely dangerous, both in a material sense and in the spiritual life. Living life on an emotional hair trigger puts us at risk of manipulation by others, which can lead only to disaster. The Christian is called to rise above the fray and to be salt and light in the world, and not to live as part of the swamp. If you like content that actually respects the traditional teachings of the Catholic Church, or are curious about traditional Catholicism and don't want to be bombarded by leftist modernist nonsense, please like this video and subscribe. You can follow me on various social media with links in the description. Dominus Vobiscum.